I will say that the information on the PPP has changed several times since the program was rolled out. And now we're seeing adjustments made, almost daily. So when we had set up this time to talk about this, my hope had been that they will have finalized all of the nuts and bolts and details about how this program was going to work. And I'm sorry to say that we're not 100% there yet. This was originally enacted as part of the CARES Act back in April, and it rolled out quickly. And fortunately, while the monies were used up in the original allocation, they came up with more. So there is still the opportunity to apply for this if you haven't yet. And in the course of all of that, they realized that the guidelines that they had put forth in the program weren't exactly serving the right companies that they had designed the program for. So they've made some adjustments, and they just put forth a new adjustment package that was approved through Congress, and we are very optimistic with what this is going to look like for anybody that's taken part in the program. But the final guidance hasn't come down to answering every single question. So the goal of this little presentation here is to give you an update on where things stand today, highlight the changes that have been made as a result of the last congressional act, and then highlight for you the things that we're still waiting on to hear, and then I'll answer whatever questions you have. So first of all, what we're going to talk about is what remains the same. The Paycheck Protection Plan was designed to give people some government funding to support the continuation of payroll, or the transition of people from unemployment back to payroll. And that hasn't changed. The calculation that would give you the amount that you are allowed to obtain through the PPP also hasn't changed. So it's a calculation that looks back to your average payroll for a month in 2019, multiplies that by 2.5 times, and that's your amount. So this slide is just talking about what's stayed the same. So your qualifying expenses have not changed at all. It's payroll, it's some health and leave benefits, payments on mortgage, interest, but not principal, any rent, any utilities, anything that you were required to pay beginning February 15th of 2020. So you can't use this to take out a new mortgage or a new car loan or anything else for your business, but anything that was in place February 15th, you can make those payments and they would count for your PPP. Now it's set up as a loan, a low interest rate loan, but it is a loan nonetheless. And the idea is that originally after June 30th, you could apply for the loan to be forgiven, assuming that you could document that you used the loan for these qualified expenses. So this is a more detailed summary about what works, what doesn't work. I think the key things here are it can work for employers for their payroll. It can also work for sole proprietors and independent contractors. So there are a couple glitches in how that works, but I think it does currently work. It's for payroll costs under $100,000. So to the extent that you have high earners above that, the only part that you can use is for below that. And as I said, the amount that you would be eligible to obtain for this loan is 2.5 times last year's average monthly payroll costs. Or if you're a self-employed person, it's not necessarily, it's not correlated to revenue, it's correlated to income. So we look back on your tax returns from either 2018 or 2019 and do the calculation that way. And so just to reiterate what I said earlier, it's any utilities That can be electricity, gas, water, like whatever your utilities typically were for your business, for anything that you were currently using prior to February 15th. You can't prepay anything. You can't, it's not going to cover the principal of your mortgage. It would cover a lease. And any debts, just to reiterate again, had to be in place prior to February 15th. So the new program is the PPP Flexibility Act, and that was put forth in Congress and then approved by the Senate. And they've made certain changes that I think are all in favor of small businesses. So I'm going to go through some of them, and I'm going to highlight for you the things that we're still waiting on details for. So the loan term was originally going to be 2 years, given the amounts that people were borrowing. Congress thought that that was not long enough. So now there is some discretion with the bank that you take your PPP loan from as to what your maturity will be. But the minimum it will be would be 5 years. So it's probably somewhere in between 5 and 10, but it would be a minimum of 5. The deadline to apply for the loan, we believe, is still June 30th, so the end of the month. There is probably a little wiggle room because they have expanded the amount of time that you had to use the loan. And I think this was really trying to address something that was one of the most confusing pieces of the PPP, was that originally in the CARES Act, it said 75% had to be used for payroll, and you had to use it on an 8-week period after the funds were dispersed to you. There was also a lot of conflicting language on that. So they tried to clarify it and give some more flexibility. So currently your minimum payroll has to be 60%, and you can use 40% of the funds for something else. And importantly, they are extending the window where you can use the funds. So, you know, there were a lot of businesses that got the PPP but weren't actually eligible to be open, so they couldn't use the funds. Now there is a longer period for disbursement, so you can use it anytime through December 31st. Now, one confusing element of this that we are still waiting for clarification on, and this I know affects everybody acutely, is whether you have the entire 24 weeks to use this, or whether you're still going to be limited to an 8-week period, but you could start that 8-week period later. And we just don't know the answer to that. I think the intent of the legislation was to give people more flexibility, and they shouldn't be penalized if they started to use it because they thought they had to use it. But we are still waiting for some clarity on that. The covered loan period has been extended, so you have, you know, it goes all the way to December 31st. Your use of funds corresponds to that. This December 31st date, which you'll see several times, is there was always going to be a date by which you were supposed to restore all of your full-time equivalent people, and that's extended to December 31st as well. So, and there's also been a little more flexibility if you have trouble rehiring people to fill the spots that you may have, you know, let people go or furloughed them. So as long as you're documenting any offer made for people to come back, you won't be penalized if they don't choose to come back. So I think that similar to how the original PPP was noted, it is the forgiveness piece of this is not black or white. So you can end up with partial forgiveness based on the use of funds. So to the extent that you use, you know, more or less of the funds in an applicable way, if you only end up using 90% of the funds that you received in something that's considered an eligible expense over the appropriate time frame, you will still be forgiven for 90%. So some people are looking at the funding that they've received through the PPP and their actual uses for their business and just doing the best they can, assuming that some of it may turn into a loan that will be long, they will have a long term to pay it back. Other people are really looking more carefully at the forgiveness rules and spending exactly to that. And that's something that I can certainly help you with. The deferral period has been extended for all payments. So regardless of when you get the loan, you have at least 10 months before you need to be starting to repay it. There was a delay in the repayment of payroll taxes, which was not previously allowed, and has been removed. That restriction has been removed. So that's one change that should let you defer paying your payroll taxes until 2021. So, you know, I know a lot of people are worried about this forgiveness, the forgiveness rules, and I sort of share the anxiety about that. You can't actually even apply for any forgiveness until July 1st, and you have all the way until easily the end of the year or the beginning of 2021. Obviously, people want to apply as soon as that they can demonstrate that they've used the funds for an eligible, forgivable expense. But there isn't a rush to do it today unless you've actually expended, you know that you've expended all of your PPP funds in an eligible way. So we've created a tool, and it's not ready to be shared broadly because we really do need these final elements of how this forgiveness will work from an operational basis and how the tests will work about, you know, how many payroll, you know, what your payroll was at the beginning to what it was at the end of the period that they're testing and the eligible amount of FTEs. But I do promise you we will have a simple tool that I can use with each of you if you would like, that you can then bring to your bank and look for forgiveness. So I'm going to put my contact information up there. I think I'm going to go back and see if there are any questions in the chat. Let me see. Okay, questions. So what payroll can you use for yourself? So it really depends what kind of organization you have. So if you look back and you were part of payroll in 2019, that's the payroll on which you should base paying yourself this year. If you were an independent contractor and you're going to be filing for the PPP in that capacity, that you look at what your net income was that you paid yourself for last year and prorate that for a monthly basis, and that would be the amount. And as long as it's consistent with what you can document that you've paid yourself in a prior, you know, in a prior period, that should be absolutely fine. And I think that the name of the game for this is document everything as detailed as you possibly can. Some people set up separate, you know, bank accounts for their PPP funds so they could, you know, make it clear. That's, you know, one strategy. Another is just to make sure that you keep record of everything that's in these categories that you're spending. Question, I was told I could not pay myself retroactively. I received my PP loan May 11th. We had little no income. So that's a good question. And I think that we may need to revisit this because there was conflicting information when the PPP came out. Originally it said you can apply and then use the funds for any period between February 15th and June 30th. They seem to have changed that guideline, and I don't have an answer yet as to whether that's going to end up to be acceptable or not, but so stand by for that. Can unemployment costs be part of payroll costs forgiven? I don't know the answer to that, but if you email me, I will get that for you. Solopreneur LLC, I'm not sure. Are the new rules applied retroactively? So any rule that I have sort of highlighted here that is, you know, sort of fully baked, then yes, it is applied retroactively. Some of them, though, you know, some of them as to whether we can pick and choose the 8 weeks, or whether we have to go from a different rule. I just don't have the answer yet. You know, my hope had been that if the government puts out a program that has rules that change, you really can't penalize people from, you know, reacting to the initial set of rules. That would make intuitive sense to me, but I can't promise that that's kind of the way it works. I'd heard the 8-week period was extended to 24. When will that be clear? We are expecting it to be clearer any day now, because it really isn't fair to people to not have that clarity. I had fully expected that by today we would have that information. So I think it should be any day, and it would probably be easy enough for us to push out some guidance to everybody on the call, since Felicia would have logged everybody. I'm surprised you still need to use the funds in 8-week period when they extended to 24. When, yeah, same. I am surprised as well, because there doesn't seem to be a good reason for that. So just stay tuned. I applied and received PPP and not knowing unemployment as well. What should I do? So it's interesting, and there's a lot of conflicting information out there. The basic guideline I've been telling people is that it's fine to avail yourself of all of these incentive programs that are available. You just can't double dip. So your PPP will only end up being forgivable if you use it for time periods that don't include the time periods you get unemployment. So what makes sense, if you haven't started to deploy any of the PPP yet, is congratulations for receiving the unemployment, because that's its own little challenge. But if you are currently getting unemployment, let that roll out and then use your PPP when your business comes back, or when the unemployment that includes the additional $600 a week runs out, which is the end of July. So, you know, hopefully that makes sense. I think that's a good way of maximizing the funds that you're receiving, giving yourself the best chance of getting the PPP forgiven, and doing it in a logical way. Oh yeah, Ginny. So if you applied for an advisor, that will probably be me. So you can just reach out to me directly. I'll type my email on the bottom so you can all see it. If I received 2 unemployment payments, yeah, look, I think there's room for confusion in all of this, because the guidelines have changed and there was so much uncertainty. So you'll see when we go through the PPP calculator, it gives you an opportunity to go line by line and what you've received, what you've used, when you've used it, and we will piece together something you know, that makes the most sense. For self-employed, the net income calculation is a result of all business expenses before withdrawing. How do you recommend documenting to manage for PPP distribution? So, I mean, the way that we're looking at that is you're going to end up showing your net income calculation off of a very specific place on your taxes, hopefully for 2019. And from that, you were able to size the amount of your PPP loan. So you know, it is a little inelegant to have to pay yourself. It's a lot easier if you've got, you know, 5 people on staff and you're paying through ADP, but the documentation for paying yourself should be, you know, a transfer of funds that came out of your business bank account into your personal. And that seems silly, but that is sort of the best I've heard of a way to do that. There was talk about audits. Yes. There is always the possibility of an audit when government programs like this are run. the SBA tries to do a very good job of minimizing fraud, and the program and the amount of funding that's been made available, you see it's in the billions of dollars. So rather than have each of these PPP forgiveness applications be subject to somebody from the SBA signing off on it, they're letting the banks do it, and they're using their judgment. And then a certain amount of these, using some sort of framework, will be audited over time. I think those will tend to be the larger ones, but that's why it always makes sense to keep a good record. You're going to need to have your PPP forgiveness story done for you to provide to your bank so that they can forgive the loan. So that should suffice for any instance in which you may be audited. I think those will be few and far between, and probably most likely would be for larger loans. But again, it should be something that once you have your forgiveness application, that's something that would also serve as a response in an audit situation. And that's why I think if it makes sense, once this is all clarified, we do have this tool. It's more of a one-on-one experience. It probably doesn't lend itself super well to doing in a group of 20, but I'm happy to work with any of you who want to have that. It's a Excel tool that builds in the algorithms that the SBA has put forth with regard to forgiveness in the multiple categories that you need to hit. So we can work that through. It'll be done. You give it to your bank, and then you have that as backup.